Number 3. Rickie Blake. On March 14, 1986, Rickie Blake celebrated her 14th birthday. She lived on a quiet street in Chula Vista, California with her parents, Bill and Alicia, and her older sister, who was also named Alicia, but went by the nickname Bootsy. Rickie's friends and family said that she was an innocent and naive 8th grade girl. She had a boyfriend, but they mostly talked over the phone, and they had never kissed. Rickie played with Cabbage Patch dolls, and she dressed the dolls in pajamas every night before bed. At about 10 p.m. one night in the spring of 1986, the phone rang in the family's home. One of Bootsy's friends answered the phone. The caller said that his name was George and he was looking for Rickie. The friend thought that George sounded like a man and he was too old to call someone Rickie's age. She told him that and then hung up the phone. This wasn't the only phone call from the man named George. The family had received other phone calls from him, and some of them were obscene. On April 10, 1986, about a month after Rickie's birthday, Bill picked up Rickie at school to take her to the dentist. They returned home that night, and Rickie complained that her teeth hurt. For dinner, Rickie had soup and ice cream. Otherwise, it was an average Thursday evening in the Blake household. Sometime between 9 and 9:30, Bill and Alicia went to bed. Rickie stayed up to watch the San Diego Padres game. Bootsy had been out that evening with friends. At 10:30 p.m., she returned home, and she had 2 friends with her. Rickie stepped outside to talk with the 3 girls. A few minutes later, the friends left and Rickie and Bootsy went inside. Rickie then got on a 3-way phone call with her boyfriend and one of her friends. While Rickie talked on the phone, Bootsy locked the front and back door. She then made Rickie get off the phone. Sometime between 11 and 11:30 p.m., the phone rang and Bootsy answered it. The caller asked for Rickie. He said his name was George. Bootsy knew 2 Georges, but the caller didn't sound like either George that she knew. In fact, she didn't recognize the voice. Rickie got the phone from her sister, and then she went into her bedroom. Bootsy then went to bed. The next morning, Rickie's mother, Alicia, woke up at 5 a.m. She went into the living room where she found the lights and the television on. The front door was also open. She went into Rickie's bedroom and she wasn't there. It was apparent that she didn't sleep there that night because her bed was still made. Also, her Cabbage Patch dolls had not been changed into their pajamas. Perhaps what was most baffling was that Rickie's shoes were beside the front door. Her mother reasoned that if she went out for a walk, or even ran away from home, she would have at least taken her shoes. Rickie's parents called neighbors and friends, but no one had seen Rickie, so they called the police. That night, at around 10:10 p.m., a call came in to the police. A motorist had found the dead body of a teenage girl lying on an off-ramp to Interstate 5 in San Diego County, about 6 miles from Rickie's home. The body was identified as 14-year-old Rickie Blake. She was wearing black pants and a pink sweatshirt, which were the clothes that she was wearing when her family last saw her alive. She wasn't wearing any shoes, and her socks were dirty. An autopsy was performed, and the cause of death was most likely strangulation, but she may have also been suffocated. There was fluid in her lungs, so it's even possible that she might have been drowned. Rickie had bruises on her face and head. It is thought she was punched, hit with a bottle, or her head was slammed into a flat surface. Rickie had a blood alcohol level of 0.4, which is a level that usually leads to unconsciousness. The medical examiner said that this could have been the result of decomposition, or she may have been force-fed alcohol. Before she died, Rickie had been sexually assaulted. The medical examiner thought that she had been killed at about 1 a.m. on the day that her body was found. The police determined that she was most likely killed elsewhere and then dumped on the off-ramp. The police never did find where Rickie was killed, and the lack of a crime scene hampered their investigation. Their strongest lead was the phone calls from the man named George. The police interviewed students at Rickie's school, and some of them said that a man named George had called them as well. But no one knew who George was. Shortly after Rickie's murder, her family started to receive strange phone calls. Their home phone number was unlisted. The caller, who was male, would ask if Rickie was there, and then he would laugh and hang up. Another time, he called and played Rickie's favorite song, With You All the Way by New Edition. Then the calls died off, but the caller didn't stop harassing Rickie's family. Rickie's birthday was March 14th, and days before her first birthday after her murder, the calls started again. The person continued to call for a month, up to the anniversary of Rickie's murder. He would call at 3 or 4 in the morning, and he would only talk to Rickie's mother, Alicia. Anytime that Rickie's father, Bill, would answer the phone, the caller would hang up. When Alicia talked to him, he would ask her if she wanted to know how Rickie died. Alicia would say she didn't want to know that, she just wanted to know who killed her. On other calls, he would recount Alicia's movements. He told her he watched her as she left her house, and he would say that he saw her at the cemetery. These calls happened every year for about a decade, and then they tapered off. Alicia said at first the calls used to frighten her. She even sent Bootsy to live with relatives out of fear that she might be harmed. But after a while, she became less frightened because she felt dead inside, and she thought that there was no way she could be hurt further. She said she actually started looking forward to the calls because she was hoping that he may say something that would lead to an arrest. But he never did. The police tapped the family's phone, but they were never able to identify the caller. Besides the phone calls, Rickie's family also noticed other unusual happenings. For example, they stored Rickie's clothes in boxes that were labeled with her name in their garage. The family discovered that someone had stolen clothes from the boxes. They also found odd things at her grave. One time they found a necklace with a heart pendant. Another time they found some loose change on her grave. Finally, they found a vase on her headstone. Inside the vase was what appeared to be strips of a man's shirt. Rickie's family wasn't sure if the stolen clothing, the items left at the gravesite, and the phone calls were connected. However, since the caller knew their unlisted phone number, knew where they lived, and knew where Rickie was buried, they thought it was definitely possible that one person was stalking them. But they also didn't know if it was just some disturbed person who was harassing them, or if he really was connected to Rickie's murder. But again, They thought it was possible. Before Rickie was murdered, George seemed to be stalking her. He had called their family's unlisted numbers several times. Just hours before she was killed, he had called the house. Since Rickie's shoes were found inside her house, the police assumed that she was kidnapped from her home. When George called, he may have lured her outside. That meant that George knew her address as well as her phone number. But Rickie's family couldn't be sure if George was the same person who called after the murder. Then in February 2003, nearly 17 years after Rickie was killed, the police made an arrest. They had matched DNA found in Rickie's underwear to a man named George Williams Jr. Williams had a horrifying criminal record. Williams was from Gary, Indiana, but in the mid-1980s, he was living in San Diego, California. In 1984, he was arrested for sexually abusing his 6-year-old daughter. In December of that year, he pleaded guilty to lewd acts with a minor under the age of 14. It's not clear what his sentence was, but in 1986, when Rickie was murdered, he was out on parole. A week after Rickie was killed, Williams was visiting his ex-wife at her apartment in San Diego. He had been drinking heavily that night. He left his ex-wife's apartment and he happened upon a woman who lived a few doors down from his ex-wife. Williams followed the woman into her apartment. Williams was armed with a knife and he tied her up. He then sexually assaulted her. When he was done, he went into the bedroom of the woman's 6-year-old daughter and he sexually assaulted her as well. After he was done, he fell asleep and the woman was able to free herself from her binds. She picked up her daughters and got out of the apartment. She then called 911 and the police arrived minutes later. They found Williams asleep in the woman's apartment and he was promptly arrested. For the 2 sexual assaults, Williams was sentenced to 17 years in prison and he ended up serving 12 years. After Williams was released from prison, he moved back to Gary, Indiana. In 1998, he was arrested again. This time it was for sexually abusing his 13-year-old nephew. He served 4 years in prison for that crime. He was arrested for the murder of Rickie about a year after he was paroled. In early 2005, Williams went to trial for Rickie's murder. In court, several witnesses testified that they saw Williams at a roller rink where Rickie and her sister were known to frequent. This is where it's believed that Rickie and Williams crossed paths. It is thought that on the night that Rickie was killed, Williams called her and lured her outside. He then kidnapped her, sexually assaulted her, killed her, and then dumped her body. Williams' lawyer said that Williams and Rickie had consensual sex before she died, and that's how his DNA ended up in her underwear. His lawyer then went on to say that there was no evidence that Williams killed Rickie. The jury ultimately found George Williams Jr. guilty, and he was sentenced to death. Since Williams was incarcerated starting a week after Rickie's murder, he could not have been the person who harassed and stalked Rickie's family in the 10 years after her murder. But who that person was and why he chose to torment Rickie Blake's family is still unknown. Number 2. Carolanne Jackson and Janet Brown. Carolanne Jackson lived alone in an isolated cottage in Woodburn Green, Buckinghamshire, England. The 50-year-old ran an antique shop out of her home. On April 13, 1997, neighbors of Jackson had not seen her in 2 days, so they went to her house to check on her. They found her dead body inside her home, and they called the police. The medical examiner determined that 2 days before her body was found, Jackson had been hit in the head several times with a blunt object. The medical examiner was not able to determine what that object was. The cause of death was asphyxiation, but there were no marks on her neck. So she may have been smothered with something like a pillow, or she could have been left unconscious face down on the floor, and she suffocated that way. Jackson's wrists and ankles were bound. There were no signs of sexual assault. One theory that the police had regarding the murder was that she was killed by an opportunist thief. On April 11th, the day that Jackson was killed, she was visiting a friend who lived about 40 miles from her own home. On her way home, Jackson stopped at an ATM and she withdrew 500 pounds. The police think that someone saw her withdraw the money and they followed her home. When she got home, she went inside and called her friend to tell her that she had arrived home safely. After hanging up, she went back to her car and started to collect items to bring inside. She was attacked there and she was forced back inside her home. She was then bound and assaulted by the killer. The police thought that the killer might have tortured Jackson in an effort to get her to explain how to get into her safe, where there was some jewelry. The killer ended up stealing the 500 pounds and a Rolex that Jackson was wearing, but it's not believed that he got into the safe. However, not everyone is convinced that Jackson was killed by someone who happened to see her withdraw money at an ATM. They think she may have been killed by someone who had been stalking her for a couple of months. In February, about 2 months before the murder, Jackson was driving home and she was sure that someone was following her. She called her neighbor and he was outside her house waiting for her when she got home. He didn't see anyone following her, but Jackson was pretty frightened. She ended up calling the police and reporting the incident. Several weeks later, Jackson was out running some errands, and when she arrived home, she saw a man standing outside of her house. She called the police, and they brought search dogs, but they couldn't find anything of interest. Jackson was concerned about her safety, and she had a home security system. One amazing aspect about the murder is the timing. When Jackson arrived home after visiting her friend, she turned off the security system and called her friend. Jackson probably would have turned the alarm back on while she was home alone, but since she was going back to her car to retrieve some items, she didn't reactivate the alarm. In this tiny window of time, she was attacked and killed. It's possible that an opportunist thief may have just gotten lucky. Or it's possible that someone who was stalking her saw this as their best opportunity to attack her. Unfortunately, since there has never been an arrest, it's not known if either theory is true. Both the police and the media saw a connection between Carolanne Jackson's murder and a murder that happened 2 years earlier to the day that Jackson was killed. Janet Brown lived in a large farmhouse in Radnage, Buckinghamshire, about 20 miles from where Carolanne Jackson lived. She and her family had purchased the house in the mid-1980s. Like Jackson's house, the Browns' home was quite isolated. Their closest neighbors were several hundred feet away. A few years after they moved in, there was a rash of break-ins in the neighborhood, so Janet set up a neighborhood watch. She also had a security system installed in her house, and she bought a Great Dane. In the spring of 1995, Janet and her husband, Graham, put their house up for sale. They were planning on moving to Canada. On the morning of April 12, 1995, a contractor and his son arrived at the house to do some work. As they approached the house, they noticed that an alarm was ringing. The lights were on in the house, and there was 2 cars parked in the driveway. The contractor and his son knocked on the front door, but no one answered. They looked through a window, and they saw the naked body of 51-year-old Janet Brown lying at the bottom of the stairs. They went and called the police. Janet had been beaten in the back of the head with a blunt object. The medical examiner thought that she had been struck at least 10 times. The murder weapon wasn't found, but it was believed to have been a crowbar. Janet's hands were handcuffed behind her back. The keys to the handcuffs were found under her body. The medical examiner also determined that her ankles had been bound at some point. Brown packing tape had been wrapped around her head 9 times. The medical examiner said had she not been beaten to death, the tape would have caused her to asphyxiate to death. Although Janet was naked, the medical examiner did not find any signs of sexual assault. The police pieced together what they thought happened the day before Janet's body was found. Janet worked as a researcher at Oxford University's Department of Public Health and Primary Care. She went to work that day and came home to an empty house. Janet's husband, Graham, was a doctor, and he lived and worked in Switzerland. He came home once or twice a month for a day or two. Janet and Graham had 3 children, but only one lived at home. Their eldest daughter lived in London, and their only son was attending school in Exeter. Their youngest daughter, 17-year-old Roxanne, lived at home, but she was out that evening. She called home sometime that evening and told her mother that she was planning on sleeping over at her friend's house. A friend of Roxanne's called the Brown household at 8:10 p.m. and Janet answered. Then Graham called at 8:30 p.m. and there was no answer. The Browns had 2 alarm systems in their house. One is an external alarm which can be heard outside of the house. It would ring for 20 minutes, and then it would automatically turn off. The other alarm system was an internal alarm that was activated by 2 panic buttons. One panic button was in the master bedroom, and the other one was near the front door. The internal alarm could only be turned off by entering a code into a number pad. Unfortunately, neither alarm was hooked up to a system that would contact a security firm or the police. At about 10:20 p.m. on the night that Janet was killed, someone driving by her house heard the external alarm. At the time, they did not know what the alarm was, and they didn't report hearing it until after they learned about the murder. When the contractor and his son found Janet's body, the internal alarm was ringing. The police thought that the killer broke in around 10 p.m., and this triggered the external alarm. The police thought that the killer got into the house through a double-pane glass patio door. He cut a hole in the exterior window, and he smashed the interior window. The police theorized that Janet heard the glass smashing, and she went to investigate. The intruder grabbed her, handcuffed her, wrapped tape around her head, and then he beat her to death. They ruled that the murder was a burglary gone wrong. But a forensic psychologist named Paul Britton, who advised on the case, did not agree with that conclusion. He thought that the killer had been stalking Janet and possibly her daughter Roxanne. When the killer broke into the house, there were 2 cars parked outside, Janet and Roxanne's. Also, there were lights on inside the house. So the intruder had to suspect that someone was in the home when he broke in. If his goal was just to rob a house, why would he choose a house where someone was home? Also, if he suspected that someone might be home, why did he smash the window? This would have made a lot of noise and attracted the attention of anyone inside. This is a terrible way to break into a random house to rob it. What if the resident was trained in martial arts or was armed with a weapon? The unexpected sound of a window breaking would usually prompt someone to grab anything that they could use as a weapon. If someone wanted to rob a house where someone was home, then they would want to be as stealth as possible. Another worry that criminals have when breaking into a home is if the resident has a dog, especially a vicious guard dog. The Browns did have a Great Dane, but it died 18 months before the murder. Bryn says that all this suggests that the person who killed Janet was stalking her. When the killer broke in, he probably just assumed that Janet and Roxanne would be there. After all, both of their cars were in the driveway. He may have been surprised that Roxanne wasn't there when he broke in. Roxanne's friend had picked her up, and she had only decided to spend the night at her friend's house earlier that evening. Bryn also doesn't believe that the killer got into the house through the patio door. Experienced burglars will often cut a hole in a pane of glass that is big enough for them to put their hand through. Then they reach through the hole and unlock the door or the window. Janet's killer didn't do that. The patio window was double paned. Instead of cutting a small hole his hand could fit through, he cut a large man-sized hole in the exterior patio window. As for the interior pane, he didn't cut a hole in it. Instead, he just smashed it. What was odd was that there seemed to be more glass outside than inside. This suggests that the pane of glass was smashed from the inside. Also, had the killer gotten in that way, he would have stepped on broken glass, and pieces of glass would have been embedded in the treads of his footwear. He would have then tracked shards and traces of glass throughout the house. But the police did not find any traces of broken glass anywhere else in the house. Another problem that Bryn had with the crime scene is that if the killer broke in by smashing the patio window, and Janet was attacked when she went to investigate the noise, then why was she naked? If most people heard something like a window breaking while they were home alone and naked, they would put on some type of clothing and then go check the source of the noise. So Bryn thinks that the killer got in some other way and surprised Janet in her bedroom. He thinks that this happened sometime between 8:10 p.m. when Roxanne's friend called and Janet answered the phone, and 8:30 p.m. when Graham called and Janet didn't answer the phone. When the killer got to the master bedroom, Janet was either naked or he made her undress. Bryn said that even though Janet had not been sexually assaulted, it was still a sex crime. Bryn said he wanted to dominate her and feed off her fear. The killer probably had a fantasy he wanted to play out. The fantasy probably included handcuffing her and wrapping her head in tape. Bryn thought that Janet may have tried to run away, and this is how she ended up at the bottom of the stairs. The killer then ran after her and beat her in the head, probably with a crowbar. After killing Janet, he washed up and quite possibly showered. Bryn thinks it's highly possible that the killer brought a spare set of clothes and he changed into them after he washed himself. Bryn thinks this because there wasn't much blood found in other parts of the house. The only exceptions were watered-down bloodstains that were found on a light switch. Bryn also said that the killer was organized. Notably, he brought two types of tape with him. He used one type of tape when he cut a hole in the patio window, and he used a different tape to wrap around Janet's head. Neither roll of tape was in the house before the murder. He also brought the murder weapon with him, and he most likely brought a spare change of clothes with him. Bryn was also sure that the killer brought the handcuffs as well. The handcuffs were another clue that the murder was a sex crime and not a burglary gone wrong. The killer had 2 rolls of tape with him, but he bound her wrists with the handcuffs. Bryn thought that the handcuffs were part of a specific fantasy that the killer had. Bryn believes that the killer remained in the house for nearly 2 hours. He thinks it's possible that the killer may have been waiting for Roxanne to come home. Bryn doesn't believe that Janet activated either the internal or the external alarm. The internal alarm had to be activated by one of 2 panic buttons. If Janet activated the alarm, then she obviously did it before she was killed. But yet, the killer stayed in the house after the murder to wash up, and he may have even possibly showered. If the alarm was ringing, he probably wouldn't have stuck around to wash up. He probably wouldn't have known that the alarm just rang and didn't alert a security company. Nor could he have been sure that the alarm wouldn't attract the attention of a neighbor who could have called the police. Basically, it would have been too risky to stay behind and wash up while the alarm was ringing. As for the external alarm, it was heard after 10 o'clock, which is about 2 hours after it's believed that the killer broke into the house. The alarm would only ring for 20 minutes, and then it would stop. If the alarm had triggered while the killer was breaking in, it probably would have scared him away, because he had no idea who might hear it, or who the alarm might notify. So Bryn thinks the killer cut and smashed the patio windows after the murder, and this triggered the external alarm. He also triggered the internal alarm as he left. This would have made it look like a random home robbery gone wrong, when it was, in fact, a targeted sex crime committed by a stalker. Bryn says the final clue that the home invasion wasn't a robbery was the fact that nothing was stolen from the house and there had been no ransacking. Bryn didn't think that this was the only crime that the killer committed. Bryn suggested looking for similarities in other sex crimes that were committed in the area. The police did that, but it did not lead to an arrest. The police also eliminated all the usual suspects, like Janet's husband, because he was in Switzerland when she was killed. The police found no evidence that Janet was having an affair, so they are fairly certain that she wasn't killed by a boyfriend. In 2015, the police announced that they had developed a DNA profile of Janet Brown's killer. They conducted mass screenings and also compared it to 300 individual suspects. Unfortunately, they did not find a match. There are several similarities between the murders of Carolanne Jackson and Janet Brown. First off, they were murdered 2 years to the day of each other. Jackson was killed on April 11, 1995, and Janet was killed on April 11, 1997. They were also close in age. Jackson was 50 years old, and Janet was 51 years old. They were both killed in their isolated houses, which were about 20 miles apart. Both were bound and struck in the head, but not sexually assaulted. Finally, both murders are unsolved. It's not known with any certainty if the 2 cases are connected, and this may not be answered until there is an arrest in at least one of the cases. Number 1. Kanika Powell. Kanika Powell was born on the last day of January 1981. She attended high school in Largo, Maryland. She graduated in 1998, and in 2000, she joined the Army. She ended up serving a tour of duty in Korea. Back stateside, she got a job with Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory as a security contractor. What she did for work was top secret, and she couldn't even explain her job to her mother. Her mother knew that her work somehow involved the military, and at times she had to travel to different cities to pick up items. On the evening of August 23, 2008, Powell was at home in her apartment in Prince George County, Maryland. At around 7 p.m., there was a knock at the door. She asked who was there, and the person who knocked on the door didn't say anything. Powell went and looked through her peephole, and she saw a man standing in front of her door. She asked him what he wanted, and he said he was with the FBI. He then held up what looked like an FBI shield in front of the peephole. He addressed Powell by her full name, and he said that he wanted to talk to her about an investigation. Powell thought that the FBI shield looked fake, so she asked for some photo ID and a warrant. Instead of providing either item, the man just walked away. She then went into her bedroom, and through her window, she saw the man walking away from her building. She thought she heard a second man yell at him to go in the opposite direction. The incident frightened Powell, so she called 911. The police arrived minutes later, and they searched the area, but they did not find anything of interest. Powell was so freaked out by the incident that she wrote the following email and sent it to friends and family. I just wanted to share with you the scariest thing that happened to me this weekend. Saturday evening around 7 p.m., a man was knocking at my door. As all of you may know, I live alone. I asked who it was and he didn't answer, so once I got close to the door and looked at the people, I saw a male figure that was not familiar to me at all. I asked who he was, and all he stated was that he was from the FBI and that he was looking for Kanika Powell. It freaked me out completely because this man knew my name. He held up a shield with no picture ID, and he never gave his name. He told me he was looking for me in regards to an investigation. I told him I had no idea as to what he was talking about, and that he would need to show me documentation as well as a warrant of some sort. So he left, and I looked out my bedroom window and saw him walking. I also heard a voice tell him to walk in the opposite direction. The whole situation was scary and seemed so false. So because of this incident, not only did I get no sleep for the rest of the weekend, but I am now trying to get an alarm system installed in my apartment. I had one in my old apartment, but I just hadn't had it transferred over to my new one. As far as everything that happened with the guy, I did call the FBI, and they told me that it was more than likely bogus, because they never come to your door by themselves, and they always leave a card of some sort so that you can contact them. I called the local police as well to give them a description, just in case someone is out there trying to rape or harm single women. Pass this on, ladies. This is not a fake forward. This happened to me, Kanika. Who knows who these guys are and what they are doing and in what areas other than mine. 4 days later, at around 7 p.m., someone knocked on Powell's apartment door. Powell asked who was there. The man said he had a package for Kanika Powell. Powell looked through her peephole and saw that it was a different man than the one who claimed to be the FBI agent. Powell didn't open the door, and the man said he was going to get her package from his vehicle. But he didn't return. He also didn't leave a note. About 12 hours later, sometime between 7 and 7:30 a.m., someone knocked on her door again. The man said that he was there to deliver a package. Once again, Powell didn't answer the door, and the man went away. Powell was disturbed by the incident, and she called her mother to talk about it. Powell thought it was strange that someone was delivering a package that early in the morning. Powell had to go out of town the next day for work, and she needed to run some errands for her trip out of town. She didn't feel comfortable running her errands after work because she didn't want to go out when it was dark. She decided to take the day off work, and that morning she went out and did her errands. Just before 11:50 a.m., Powell returned home. Someone was waiting for her in her hallway. He shot her multiple times in the torso with a handgun and then fled. A neighbor heard the gunshots and called 911. Powell was found unconscious on the floor in front of the door to her apartment. She was rushed to the hospital, but she never regained consciousness. 28-year-old Kanika Powell was pronounced dead the next day. The police investigated the usual suspects first, but it was a dead end. Powell wasn't dating anyone, she didn't have any disgruntled exes, nor did she have any problems with rejected admirers. Her friends and family couldn't think of anyone who would have wanted to hurt her. Powell's keys and her wallet were lying beside her when she was found unconscious, so robbery didn't seem to be the motive. There has been some speculation that Powell's murder was connected to her top-secret job. This theory was bolstered by something that happened about 2.5 months after her murder. Like Kanika Powell, 31-year-old Sean Nicholas Green had top-secret security clearance. He did tech support at the National Counterterrorism Center. He worked with computers that had sensitive national security information. Green was single, and he had never been married. He was close with his family, and he adored his 8 young nephews. Green lived a quiet life, and he referred to himself as a square. Like Powell, no one could think of why anyone would want to hurt Green. On November 12, 2008, Green was shot to death in his car as he was waiting at a red light. He was killed about 25 miles away from Powell's apartment. Like Powell, he had been shot multiple times in the torso with a handgun. While it wasn't made public how many times Powell was shot, Green was shot 9 times. Green's brother said that he went to the gym around the same time every day. He was killed at the time he usually drove to the gym. He was also killed on the route he took to the gym. So it's thought that the killer stalked him enough to know his routine. Another explanation is that Green wasn't targeted, and his murder was just a random act of violence, where he may have been killed in a case of mistaken identity. Some people don't think that Green was randomly or accidentally murdered. They think that both Powell and Green were killed because of their work. But other people say that the connection is too loose. They both had top-secret security clearance, but Powell and Green had completely different jobs and worked in different departments. Detectives who investigated Powell's murder don't think she was killed because of her work. One reason they believe this is because it doesn't seem like her murder was a professional hit. It's assumed that Powell was killed by one of the men who came to her door. By coming to her door multiple times, they could have exposed themselves. People could have seen them coming and going from the apartment. Green's murder seems more like a professional hit. He was killed while he was following his routine, and there were no witnesses. If Green thought he was being followed before he was killed, he didn't tell anyone. Since no arrest was made in either case, it's impossible to say with any certainty if the two murders are connected. Another theory about the murder of Kanika Powell is that she was murdered by a serial killer. On the morning of June 24, 2008, the fire department was called to a house fire in Bowie, Maryland, which is in Prince George County. Inside the house, they found the dead body of 46-year-old Vilma Butler. Butler's death was not a result of the fire. Instead, she was shot in the torso, and then her house was torched. Butler's home was equipped with a sprinkler system, but it appeared to have been disabled before the fire was started. 2 months after Butler was killed, Kanika Powell was shot multiple times in the torso outside of her apartment. 4 months after Powell's murder, at 2 a.m. on January 26, 2009, 16-year-old Carissa Lofton called 911. She whispered to the dispatcher that she needed help. She and her mother, 45-year-old Karen Lofton, had both been shot. First responders rushed to their home in Largo, Maryland, which is also in Prince George County. Sadly, they were too late. The mother and daughter were both dead by the time they arrived at their home. In the early morning hours of March 16, 2009, about a month after the Loftons were killed, the fire department was called to a vacant house in Logan. A stolen Nissan Maxima was on fire in the driveway. They put out the fire and discovered 2 bodies in the car. One was in the back seat, and the other was in the trunk of the car. The bodies were so severely burned that the fire department didn't even know what sex the victims were. The Nissan Maxima had been reported stolen just a few minutes before the fire department was called. Someone had broken into the owner's home and stolen the keys. While the owner of the car was on the phone with 911 reporting the robbery, she saw the car drive by, but she didn't get a good look at the driver. The next day, the police identified the bodies as 42-year-old Dolores DeWitt and her daughter, 19-year-old Ebony. Dolores and Ebony were reported missing shortly before their bodies were found. They were supposed to pick up a relative at the bus station, but they never did. The relative took a cab to their home and found the lights on, and their car was in the driveway. She called their cell phone several times, but they didn't answer. She got a bad feeling, so she reported them missing. It turned out that Dolores and Ebony had both been strangled to death. The police thought that the murders of Dolores and Ebony and Karen and Carissa were connected. Both sets of victims were mother and daughter. They lived within a mile of each other, and they were all killed in the early morning hours of a Monday. The police got their first lead in the murders several weeks later. The ATF was investigating the robbery of a gun store in Woodbine, Maryland. They learned from an informant that 27-year-old Jason Thomas Scott was involved in the robbery. Around the time of the murders, there had been a rash of break-ins and home invasions in Prince George County. When the police searched Scott's home, they found items that had been reported stolen from the break-ins and the home invasions. On a flash drive, they found photos of a teenage girl who had been sexually assaulted during one of the home invasions. Scott worked part-time at UPS. His job was to fix incorrect addresses on items that couldn't be delivered. The police checked the company's computer records. While Scott was working, Someone had looked up the DeWitt's information on a computer. 2 other searches that were performed while Scott was working caught the interest of the police. Someone had looked up the address of Vilma Butler and the address of the home where the Nissan Maxima was stolen from. The police searched a vacant house where Scott hid his burglary tools and the clothes he wore when he broke into people's homes. In the vacant house, they found burned remnants of the DeWitt's clothes. Scott often committed his crimes with an accomplice. Earlier on the night that the DeWitts were killed, Scott and a partner robbed a house that was just down the street from the DeWitt's house. His partner said that after the robbery, he dropped off Scott near the DeWitt's house. The police found other evidence that connected Scott to the murder of the DeWitts, and he was indicted on their murders a few weeks after he was arrested. The police suspected that he murdered Vilma Butler and Karen and Carissa Lofton as well, but they couldn't find any evidence to connect him to those murders, so he wasn't charged. In September 2013, Scott entered an Alford plea for the murders of Dolores and Ebony DeWitt. When someone takes an Alford plea, they are not pleading guilty, but they acknowledge that if they went to trial, the district attorney would have enough evidence to convict them. Scott also confessed to 28 home robberies, 9 armed home invasions, and a gun store robbery. He also admitted to selling stolen guns on the street. In total, for all his crimes, he received 179 years in prison. Scott is considered a suspect in Kanika Powell's murder for several reasons. First, at least 2 men knocked on Powell's door, and she thought that the fake FBI agent had another man with him when he came to her apartment building. Scott worked with accomplices on several of his crimes. Secondly, Scott worked at UPS, and it's thought that he found out information about his victims by using their computers. When the men came to Powell's door, one thing that really freaked her out was that they knew her name. Using the UPS computer system, Scott could have found out Powell's name based on her address. Also, 2 times, a man claiming to deliver a package knocked on her door. Scott could have got the idea to use this ploy from his day job. Powell's murder also happened right in the midst of Scott's killing spree. She was killed 2 months after Vilma Butler was murdered, and 4 months before Karen and Carissa Lofton were killed. Powell, like Butler and the Loftons, was shot with a handgun, and Scott had access to many guns. Scott has never confessed to being involved in Powell's murder, and no evidence connects him to the crime. At the time of this video, Kanika Powell's murder remains unsolved, and the case is considered cold. The police think that Jason Thomas Scott may be responsible for murders in places he visited, like Washington, D.C., Texas, and Florida. Thanks a lot for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please go to criminallylisted.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about an exclusive podcast. Well, that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.